Okay, so this is the second part. Okay, now, just now in the previous part, we discussed about what is meant by GDP. We discussed about how to measure GDP. And we also discussed about GDP is commonly used as an indicator for economic growth and also economic development. So this time around, we go in depth, like how GDP can be used as an economic indicator for development and what other indicators that can be used. Okay, so before that, let me just draw this kind of like picture here. Okay, first of all, as mentioned previously, when we want to find out what is the economic development of a country, okay, economic development basically relates directly to standard of living. And in order to measure economic developments of a country, we need to look into like GDP. And that day, we also talk about economic development is basically referring to the social and economic progress of a country, which include GDP. And when it comes to social progress, we also need to look into education. We also need to look into health care. Okay, and also we need to look into what is the environment, what kind of environment that the country actually, the people are enjoying. And we also look into the social security aspect. We also look into the freedom. We also look into the amount of leisure hour that people enjoy. We also look into the sanitations of the country. We also look into whether the people can access to clean water or not. So therefore, basically, economic development includes a lot of different aspects. But then, still, GDP is considered one of the widely and most popular indicator for standard of living. And therefore, when we are asked why GDP is considered most of the most common indicator for standard of living, it is often, okay, we need to talk about the pros and cons of using GDP as an indicator for standard of living. Now, first of all, GDP, as mentioned, it is a quantitative method, right? So therefore, GDP is very objective. Objective as in every country we measure GDP using the same way. So when it is very objective, it can be used to compare standard of living between countries easily. Okay, this is why GDP is mostly used. Secondly, GDP is considered one of the very easily understandable indicator compared to the rest, because GDP is a figurative method. So when I observe the GDP, then I can tell, oh, Singapore GDP is higher than Thailand's GDP. So Singapore is having higher standard of living than Thailand. So it is something that you can understand by looking at a figure, even though you haven't learned econs before. You didn't take econs in A level, you possess a degree in econs, you also can understand GDP figure, okay? But GDP is considered a very direct indicator, as in when GDP rises, meaning that income rises, meaning that people can enjoy higher income, they can buy more goods and services, leading to higher standard of living. And GDP rises also means where more goods and services are being produced in the country, so people can get to access to a wider range of goods and services, improving their standard of living. So that is generally the pros of using GDP as an indicator for standard of living, all right? However, guys, GDP, as mentioned, come with a list of cons. So let's look at some common cons. For example, GDP, although the country's total output may rise, but doesn't mean that individuals are enjoying more goods and services. So GDP doesn't take into account population growth. So GDP per capita might be a better measure, okay? And next, GDP doesn't take into account inflation. So even though nominal GDP might be high, but people are suffering from higher inflation rate, making their purchasing power to fall, so they can actually enjoy lesser amount of goods and services, okay? And also, GDP doesn't reflect the externality. So maybe the GDP or the GDP per capita in the country is high, but people are suffering from severe pollution, environmental degradation, so affecting the citizens' standard of living. Okay, and also, guys, as mentioned, like maybe one country has higher GDP than another country. Country A has higher GDP than country B, but doesn't mean that like country A standard of living is higher. Maybe country B, although the GDP captured is low, but country B might have high amount of non-marketed goods and services, high amount of like subsistence economy. So basically the people in country B, they are enjoying good lifestyle as well. Okay. And also guys, like maybe South Korea, Japan, they might be enjoying really high GDP and GDP per capita, but then their working hours is long, and then their working environment is actually quite stressful. So this might be affecting their standard of living as well. So therefore, using GDP, we have a lot of weaknesses. And also guys, I have compiled some so-called higher end weaknesses for GDP. So if you don't want to go for those normal saying like externality and working hours and so on, you can choose this, yeah. So first of all, high GDP doesn't show like high political freedom. So although in my country, I enjoy high GDP per capita, but then I don't have freedom of speech, where freedom of speech or political freedom might be one of the indicator for quality of life. So freedom, human rights. So therefore, in some government, in some countries, trade unions are prohibited, and then opposition voice is prohibited. Then although like you have high income, but still your quality of life is lower. Next, in some country, maybe their GDP per capita is really high, but then people are not like free from fear of violence. So maybe in some countries, people are free to possess weapons or guns or whatever. So maybe GDP per capita is really high, but then you don't know how safe you are when you're walking on the street. So this also like making GDP not a good indicator for quality of life and standard of living, because quality of life and standard of living will take into account this thing. Okay. Lastly, guys, I find this point really like funny, because according to this point, they say the quality of life and the standard of living will take into account your spiritual state. Okay, how rich you are mentally and spiritually. So, and how rich your soul and your life is affected by the appreciations of art and appreciations of culture. Therefore, from this point, they say like even though Singapore might have higher GDP per capita than people in London, but Singapore is a country with limited amount of history and limited amount of like cultural and art cultivation. So therefore, despite the fact they have higher GDP per capita, but people in London are still richer in their soul and in their mind and in their mental, spiritual state. So therefore, GDP might not be a good indicator for standard of living or quality of life. So if you like those points, you can include those points in your writing. Okay, all right. Okay, moving on. After we discuss GDP as an indicator for standard of living, we mentioned where GDP is suitable or GDP is not so suitable, okay? Then next, we will need to offer, is there any alternative that we can use in order to measure GDP other than, in order to measure standard of living other than GDP, despite a lot of weaknesses we found in GDP? So as mentioned just now, we can use GDP per capita as another indicator for standard of living. So GDP per capita is slightly better than GDP because at least GDP per capita is adjusted to the changes in population. At least it shows you precisely what is the average income per head, what is the income per person earned in the earned by the citizens in the country. So it also like shows you averagely how much goods and services that per person can enjoy. Okay, so therefore, when you are offering other indicators, we need to follow certain routes, certain sequences. First of all, you need to define what is that particular indicator. You need to tell me how it works. And if better, you give me examples that can be linked to the real life. And also, lastly, you discuss one pro and one con of that particular indicator. Okay, all right. So therefore, how to define GDP per capita? It is average income per person. And then after that, we mentioned like this is the formula to compile. And guys, if I say real GDP per capita, meaning that after you adjust to the changes in population, you need to adjust to changes in price level in order to form real GDP per capita. So now moving on, when there is a rise in GDP per capita, it shows that rising productivity. So therefore, people might be able to enjoy like more goods and services. And therefore, when you are offering like an example, you can say like what you all have searched. Some of you have searched it out, yes, in the previous lesson, mentioning like Malaysia, our GDP per capita is 11,000 USD per annum, whereby Singapore now, the GDP per capita is somewhere around 64,000 USD per annum, according to Google search. So from there, we can tell that Singapore is having higher standard of living than Malaysia. Okay, and let's look at the pro. The only pro for GDP per capita, at least, okay, it takes into account changes in population. So showing a more precise outcome on individual standard of living, the individual citizens, okay? But then the con is still a lot, whereby GDP per capita might not include a lot of aspects like environmental changes and number of hours worked, leisure times, and sometimes you can even look into that, like GDP per capita also doesn't include non-marketed goods and services and so on. So that is, there are a lot of cons. But one of the cons, which is standardized for all indicators, is still standard of living includes a lot of aspects, but GDP per capita only includes very limited aspect. So that is another cons that we can use commonly, okay? Now, moving on, we still have other indicators. And before I talk about Human Development Index, I would like you to scroll to the back and look for an indicator called Measure of Economic Welfare. I always like to talk about this measure of economic welfare because this measure of economic welfare is an indicator purposely introduced to adjust to some of the limitations of GDP. So it provides a better adjustment to GDP. So basically, since we talk about a lot of weaknesses of GDP, by using MEW, we can see an improved version of GDP indicator. So because we mentioned where GDP doesn't include environmental damages, so in MEW, we use value of GDP to minus off the value of environmental damages. And since we mentioned whereby GDP doesn't capture non-marketed goods and services, so in MEW, we include the value of non-marketed goods and services. And also, since we mentioned where GDP doesn't reflect the amount of leisure hour or working hours, so here we include the value of leisure time as a plus point to GDP. So by using this measure of economic welfare, so basically uh, this measure of economic welfare is creating a more sophisticated index and sustainable development. This is the pro, and also it includes like more aspect of standard of living, so giving a better picture to other people. Okay, so but then guys, when you talk about limitations, we have a lot to talk about. First of all, how are you going to measure this externality accurately? So therefore, it is very difficult to provide a monetary value on environmental damages. One thing. Secondly, guys, how are you going to capture the value of unpaid work? So, like I always share with I always share with my students. I'm asking you whether the government should set up a website. Let's say you are a barber. Now you cut the hair of your friends without charges, okay, or maybe your parents. So you will need to log on to the government website and click. Today, one hair is cut, one service is produced, but not monetized. So is it you need to do like that? And maybe today you help your auntie to take care of, to babysit her children. It is a service, babysitting services. So you go to the website and log on and key in this information. Oh, today I help my aunt to babysit my niece and nephews or whatever. So this is the way for us to capture. So again, it is very difficult to capture the value of unpaid work. And talk about the value of leisure time, it is also very difficult to capture. So is it like you need to conduct a survey, or maybe you need to find a proper way to jot down how much of leisure time that averagely people are enjoying or whatever. So therefore, although MEW seems a better indicator for GDP, more ideal, but how are you going to capture this kind of statistic? And without this aspect, GDP itself is already exposed or subjected to data inaccuracy. So what about this thing? So that's the case lah, okay? Okay, so then we continue. We go back to other indicator, which is HDI. We call it Human Development Index. So guys, for Human Development Index, we learned it back in IG. If you did learn econs in IG, you learn this Human Development Index a little bit, okay? And also, if I'm not wrong, if you are doing geography, if you are learning standard of living and developing countries, you might come across with Human Development Index. So now, Human Development Index, and later on, we are going to learn something called Human Poverty Index. They are both composite index. Composite index meaning that we are taking 3 individual indicators and then we tie them, we bundle them up. So that is what we call composite index. And after we bundle them up, we are taking an average figure out of those. Okay. So this Human Development Index by name is like a composite index by definition. And then how it works, it includes 3 important measures. First of all, it includes GDP per capita. So we bundle up GDP per capita. Secondly, we bundle up education knowledge through the measure of adult literacy rate. Third, we bundle up healthcare through long and healthy life, by life expectancy at birth. Okay, so now the higher the HDI index, the HDI figure, the higher the standard of living. So for example, like Norway, the HDI is somewhere around 0.95, considered one of the highest. So if you compare with Malaysia, if I'm not wrong, if our HDI figure is somewhere around 0.82, okay, then of course in comparison, Norway is having higher standard of living than Malaysia. If we look into this aspect. And so how we actually calculate, we take the average figure. So for example, in terms of GDP per capita, we hit 0.9. And then in terms of adult literacy rate, we hit 0.7. In terms of life expectancy, we hit 0.8. Then what is our overall HDI is we use 0.9 plus 0.8 plus 0.7 divided by 3. Then we get an average figure out of 3. So that is HDI value lah. And of course, when we talk about the pros of HDI, so HDI is a qualitative measure, and HDI is better than GDP because at least HDI includes the 3 most important aspects of SOL. So the 3 most important aspects is actually education, healthcare, and our GDP per capita. Because GDP per capita will affect how much consumer goods that you can consume. And the level of healthcare and education will basically affect the social progress of the particular country. However, again, a very common indicator, a very common weakness of all indicators is still limited dimensions are being included or limited aspects are being included because standard of living is really broad. So this HDI doesn't include externality, doesn't include like, doesn't reflect price level, changes in price level. So therefore, it is still considered not the best lah. Actually, we don't have something called the best indicator. So in order to give a better picture of standard of living, we need to take into account different indicators. We need to look into qualitative and also quantitative. We cannot look into only one. We need to look into a few in order to judge or in order to decide or conclude, okay? Next, this is a further explanation for like narrow dimension because it doesn't provide you other informations like malnutrition, income distributions, and political freedoms and so on, whatever we mentioned, okay, which is not in HDI, okay? And HDI is a flaw because the score is average out. So like sometimes if my overall HDI recorded like 0.7, but it doesn't mean that we are really that good. It might be due to our GDP per capita is really high, but somehow in other aspects, in healthcare, in education, we are actually quite weak. So average out, we still get 0.7. So that is how it works. Just like your average score of your academic performance is 0.7, okay, out of 1. But it might be due to you are extremely strong in math, but then you might not be as strong in econs and in one other subject. So therefore, your average doesn't reflect your overall strength, doesn't reflect your strength in individual subjects. And lastly, guys, I really like this point. I always tell all my students saying that I like this point really much. Okay, longevity doesn't show anything. Long life expectancy doesn't show anything. So a person might be able to live up to 110 years old, but they spend the remaining 30 years of their life lying on the bed in the hospital. So therefore, longevity can also be distorted because life expectancy doesn't consider how healthy the person is. So that's why I'm thinking where if you are given a choice to live up to 60 years old, but you die straight, You don't need to spend any time lying on the bed receiving treatment, okay? Or you live up to 90 years old, but you will spend the remaining 20 years lying on a bed and then receiving treatment and in need of care by your family members or whatever. So what is your choice? So that's why I like this point. It is a point that we can ponder. It is a very philosophical aspect that we need to ponder that I always like that. Okay, so that is HDI. Then moving on, we look at another aspect. We call it Human Poverty Index. We discussed what is meant by relative and absolute poverty before. And guys, here I include a little bit of information. What are the causes of poverty? And some of you I did share with you like the causes of countries being poor. So if we happen like haven't watched this video yet, so I will send you the link later that you can watch the video later. And moving on, guys, for causes of poverty, these causes are actually which will form into something called vicious cycle, a bad cycle that will keep on going and going round, okay? So one of the causes of vicious cycle poverty might be because lack of human capital. Your human capital like labor and enterprise are of poor qualifications due to lack of education. When you have lack of human capital, it will lead to lack of productivity or lower productivity, okay? And some countries, they are poor because they are lack of financial capital. Therefore, we have the World Bank serving as an organization that offer funds for them to develop their countries. And when human capital is also affected by health, that's why I said education and healthcare, they are two important aspects of standard of living. And guys, after that, we can mention whereby because these people are fall under poverty trap. Remember we talked about unemployment benefits or state benefits. And guys, the saddest case is when people are born to be poor. Okay, due to there are a lot of economic research saying that when people are born to be poor and the effort needs to jump out from the poverty cycle is actually a lot. So, which means, although this doesn't mean to be pessimistic, I come from not a very wealthy family as well, so I need to work extra hard. But for a person coming from not a very good background itself, in order to jump up from poverty, it is quite difficult. It is not like discouraging or whatever, but there is one data response that we are going to do. They talk about inequality. So when people are born to be rich, you are grabbing more opportunities and you start the race at a more advantaged position compared to the poorer people. So that is how it works. So this is the vicious cycle that you all can look into. And let's look at what is meant by Human Poverty Index. Okay, Human Development Index is a positive indicator. It measures how much you have. But Human Poverty Index measures how much you don't have, how much you are deprived from. That is what we call Human Poverty Index. And this Human Poverty Index is also a composite index because we bundle up 3 individual indicators, okay? Therefore, like this Human Poverty Index is a bit similar to Development Index. It's just that their position, their direction is one is positive, another one is negative. So if you look at this Human Poverty Index, the higher your HPI, the poorer the country is. So that is different from Human Development Index. Okay, now moving on, if you look at Human Poverty Index, we also measure similar aspects like Human Development Index, like longevity, which is to reflect your healthcare, knowledge, which is to reflect your education, decent standard of living, which is to reflect your GDP per capita. But then for HPI, it is a bit tedious because before we start measuring, we will need to group the countries under two categories first. Just like we compete within the category, we rank you within the category. So just like when you are going for taekwondo, when you are going for like competitions or math competitions, they group you below 18, above 18, or below 80 kg, above 80 kg. So HPI works in such a way as well. Okay, so we have HPI-1, which is meant for the poorer countries, which is the developing countries. And we have HPI-2, which is meant for the more developed countries. Okay, so for HPI-1 and -2, we include the same indicators, the same benchmark, but then different threshold. So for HPI-1, in order to be regarded as less poor, your longevity has to reach above 40. So if the people in this group of countries can live up to 40, you are not considered like very poor, okay? Likewise, in terms of knowledge, they just want you to know how to read and write, adult literacy rate. And in terms of decent standard of living, as long as the percentage of people who are malnutrition or underweight is not that high, or people can use improved water source, then like access to better access to clean water, then these people are considered not very like poor. Okay. However, this HPI-2, if you look at the threshold for longevity, they need to reach up to 60, then it is considered good. It is considered not as poor. And then for knowledge, they need like people to have functional skill instead of literacy skill. Functional skill meaning that if people possess the skill required to perform a job well, then you are considered not as poor. And lastly, in terms of standard of living, they measure how many people who are in absolute poverty, which means below the poverty line, and which includes the long-term unemployment rate and so on. So therefore, we have the same way to measure, but then we have different threshold to score. So as mentioned, the higher the HPI, the poorer the country is. That's the case. However, in terms of pro of HPI, honestly, I cannot find any actual pro except for they measure from the aspect of deprivation, okay, how much people are deprived from. And there are limitations of HPI as well. Again, limited dimension, limited aspect being measures, and a weightage problem, okay, because different country, they due to some demographic factors or whatever, they might be severely deprived from something and not so severely deprived from something. So if we use an average figure of 3, it might be a bit unfair, okay? And also till now, yeah, guys, HPI is not well documented yet due to a lot of recording and a lot of inaccuracy. And you see, you look at the benchmark itself, especially for the poorer countries, it is so like subjective. What is meant by improved water source, you know, like what is the proper measure of it? And in order to capture the percentage of children underweight, but most of the time the countries fall under HPI-1, they are not very educated. If they are not very educated, how are we going to do a proper statistic measures for this kind of aspect? So That is generally the problem for HPI. Okay. Then now, guys, moving on, since just now we mentioned where HPI includes limited dimensions. So now I introduce you another poverty index that includes a lot of dimension, which we call it multi-dimensional poverty index. Okay, multi-dimensional meaning that we need to see whether people are deprived and then what people are deprived from, and we want to find out whether people are deprived from a wide range of factors or dimension. So we introduce this multi-dimensional poverty index. However, although it is multi-dimensional, but down to the point we also grouped it under these three broad categories, health, education, and standard of living. And again, as mentioned, it measures how much you are deprived from. So again, the higher the MPI signifies the higher the poverty, which means the poorer the country. And which means the lower the standard of living. And in under this multi-dimensional poverty index, we look at, there are three indicators. So the weightage problem. So everything is being like solved. Okay, every individual dimension is given 33.3% of weightage. And in health category, there are two things, nutrition and child mortality. So we will divide it 16.7%. So which means, I quote you one example. Let's say in country A, they didn't face any problem of child mortality. So in terms of this health category, in terms of child mortality, they will be scoring 0% compared to some African countries which face severe child mortality problem. Then their score might be like higher 15% or 16%, or worst case is 16.7. Okay. Moving on, in terms of education as well. So if this country, they have 90 and above percentage of people enroll in education, then their score for this part will be very low, like 0 to 2%. But then if this country has high percentage of children not enroll to the school, then this part, the weightage score might be really high, like 16% or 16.7, the max. And lastly, in terms of standard of living, we include six individual indicators, which we use 33.3 to divide by 6, so each will be 5.6%. So these 6 indicators include cooking fuels and assets and so on. So I could choose some example based on my understanding. For example, in terms of cooking fuel, we want to assess whether you are using gas stove, or like we are using animal dung as your source of fuel. And if you're using induction cooker nowadays, then it is even more high-end. Then you are even less poor. And then in terms of assets, we might assess how many like units of consumer goods that meant for comfortable living of living, like mobile phones, like maybe how many aircons you have at home. Okay, if you have more than 2 aircons, you are considered less poor. If you don't have any aircons, maybe you are considered poor. But this is also not like very fair, because in some countries, like European countries, generally they don't really have aircons in room, because in overall, other than summer, their weather is quite like nice, which they don't really need aircon. Okay, so but this is the indicator lah. And then in terms of toilet, I heard like some lecturers saying whereby they say if they measure whether you have a flush toilet or those manual toilet that you need to flush by yourself, Okay, you need to wait for the water to be filled up, and then you need to do it manually. Or maybe those toilet in the outskirt area that straight away go down to the river or whatever. So to assess how poor you are. And in terms of electricity, I think this is very normal. It assesses how many hours of electricity that you can access to per day. Because if you want to live a more comfortable lifestyle, electricity is essential. You look at all the electrical appliances that make your life better. So therefore, for countries that cannot have access to electricity whole day, they might be scoring very high weightage here, like close to 5.6%. And next, water is also a very general indicator, whether you can access to clean water or not, whether your water from pipe is safe to drink directly or not, okay? And lastly, floor, maybe they assess like what you use to make your floor, maybe tiles, maybe a cement, maybe just straight away you sleep on the sand or whatever it is, okay? So that is multidimensional poverty index. And guys, I write here, this index is comprehensive but complicated. Complicated as in it is very difficult to measure and record. Until now, we are yet to have reliable data. We don't really have like very reliable data till now. But then it is comprehensive as in this is the pro where it allows government to know or to identify their weaknesses and which aspect to improve. So that is multi-dimensional poverty index, okay? All right, so guys, this is basically like the general indicators for standard of living. And lastly, I have one thing called Kuznets curve. This Kuznets curve, to me, it is not really meant to use to assess standard of living in different countries. However, I have seen a few mark schemes stating when you are asked to offer what are the indicators for standard of living, they accept Kuznets curve. So therefore, let's look at what is Kuznets curve lah. Basically, Kuznets curve shows you the relationship between economic inequality and income per capita. As we all know, income per capita shows how developed your country is. The higher the GDP per capita, we are like just now, we said the more developed the countries. So now, according to this Kuznets curve, we look at this part here. This is the diagram. So you see, according to Kuznets curve, when the GDP per capita rises, initially your income inequality will rise, but come to one point, your income inequality will fall. So they mention like what is the reason here, yeah? So guys, these are the explanation. At the beginning, when the country first grow, first achieving development, the opportunities will be obtained by those people who have ready capital, which means those people who have abundant of capitals available, money available, they will grab the opportunities to invest. Therefore, when we say income inequality, it is because of your opportunities is different, okay? So this is, and therefore, when the opportunities are obtained by the rich people, then the rich people will be richer and the poor people will be poorer. Secondly, they mentioned where there will be a lot of like outskirt people flooding into all the urban area to look for jobs. And then basically when people are flooding into the cities area, you will press the wage rate lower and making the working class, the workers poorer, making the employers richer. Okay, all right. And moving on, so after this, according to Kuznets curve, that is the initial stage which made your income inequality rising, okay, as your country start to grow, start to develop. However, when come to one point, okay, these people will seek for better pay job, and when come to one point, when the urban population start rising, then the income gap will start to fall. So according to this Kuznets hypothesis, when the country become more and more like developed, people are more and more educated, and therefore people are more and more aware of their human rights, and government is offering more and more social welfares and so on. So therefore, when come to one point, when the country is very developed, and these people of the higher income group, they will start spending, and then they will generating income, and then because they are paying tax, government is offering welfare services to those people of lower income group, then eventually they will make the income inequality to fall, to reduce, and the income distribution will get more and more equal. So that is what happened eventually. Your income inequality will fall when the country start to become very, very like developed. Okay, so now it seems like according to the hypothesis, according to the way that Kuznets curve explained, it seems valid. It seems quite logic. However, guys, let's do some evaluation here. In the reality, do you think as the country develop, the income inequality is getting lower and lower? Do you really see this kind of situation? So let's consider US. Okay, let's consider, I think China also. Okay, let's consider some European countries. Is this situation of rising income per capita, rising development, leading to falling income inequality? So is it really like happening to this kind of countries? And not only the mentioned countries, yeah, those countries which is not mentioned, is it true that this Kuznets hypothesis works or applies? So let's ponder and let's think about it. Okay, and now guys, I would like to show you one of the biggest problem of Kuznets curve is the Kuznets curve is actually not a very like valid hypothesis. Why? Because the Kuznets curve doesn't reflect the average progress of a country. So if you want to observe whether the country has undergone this kind of changes, you must observe individual countries' progress. You must obtain time series data. Unfortunately, this Kuznets curve is just a historical data, as in they plot the curve, okay, based on some historical statistic. So for example, this Kuznets happened to see the data of UK. Okay, UK GDP per capita is this much, and income inequality is this much. And then he happened to went through like India, GDP per capita is this much, then income inequality is this much. And then like, let's say maybe US, maybe Norway, maybe China. So by using this kind of historical data, and eventually this Kuznets curve is formed by connecting all the plotted points. Therefore, this Kuznets curve is not very convincing because it doesn't really observe a country's progress in a time series manner. So therefore, like when we are talking about this reliability of Kuznets curve, this can be criticized. And guys, that's all, yeah, for the indicators for standard of living under in our syllabus. And guys, I just want to show you like one of the examples of multiple choice that I have seen, which asks about Kuznets curve. Okay, in that particular multiple choice, they give you this Kuznets curve, and with this label and this label are y-axis and x-axis. They show you the turning point is 57,000, let's say, USD. So they show you this is the turning point. The turning point is 57,000 GDP per capita. And now the country's GDP per capita is, let's say, 32,000. Okay, this is what happened. This is where the country is standing. They say what would happen to income inequality as the country continue to grow or to develop. So now guys, you see the question say the turning point is 57,000 and now the country is standing at 32,000. So what you need to do is you just need to find out 32,000, the country is here. So as the country continue to grow, the income inequality will rise for now, will rise at the initial stage. Only when they pass the turning point, the country income inequality will fall. So that's one of the examples of multiple choice that I have seen for Kuznets curve, okay, where we will look at the question again during our MCQ discussion. All right, so that's all for this particular chapter, and that's all for the part 2 of this particular lesson. So any questions we can discuss during the next lesson. So all right, see you. Thank you very much, guys. Thanks for staying with me. I'll see you again. Bye bye.